Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating devotional from a text called 31 Days of Worship. We're specifically zeroing in on day 27, which tackles a struggle I think literally every single one of us can relate to: fear. But what's great about this source is that it doesn't just brush fear off as some passing, fleeting feeling. Instead, it systematically breaks down exactly how fear works, and then it offers a very specific, structured biblical antidote to combat it. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this by defining our terms, exactly the way the source text does. The author actually anchors their entire argument on a specific definition from the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. They define fear as the emotional foreboding or dread of impending distress or misfortune. Now, what's really interesting about this specific definition is how it frames fear. It's all about anticipation. It's not necessarily just a reaction to a clear and present danger. Rather, it is this paralyzing dread of what might happen. It's that impending distress. You know that heavy, sinking sense of foreboding in the pit of your stomach? That's exactly what we're talking about here.
So that brings us to our first major theme, Section 1, the anatomy of fear, and exactly how it impacts us.
The text breaks down the toll of this dread into three distinct categories. According to the author, if we let this fear fester, it can cause emotional issues, physical ailments, and spiritual confusion to just completely plague our lives. And it's a compounding negative effect too. The author points out that a lot of believers deeply suffer from the fear of the unknown, the fear of the future, and especially the fear of things that simply cannot be changed. This really highlights the core problem the text is trying to solve. For some folks, this fear grips their lives so tightly that they are completely paralyzed by it. They literally cannot move forward. It acts as a total roadblock to any kind of personal or spiritual progression. Now, this brings up a really pivotal question in the text's narrative. Think about it. If fear is this deeply ingrained natural force that plagues us with all these physical and emotional ailments, why in the world does the Bible repeatedly tell its followers not to fear? I mean, the text acknowledges that this command appears over and over again, but how can you realistically command someone not to feel a natural emotion? Well, to answer that, the text pivots directly to a theological solution.
And that leads us to Section 2, the biblical antidote, and overcoming fear.
The author introduces a core scriptural counter-narrative, and it's found in 1 John chapter 4, verse 4. It says, "Because greater is he that is in us than he that is in this world." This right here is the foundational theological logic the author uses to argue against fear. And notice, the argument isn't just, try harder not to be afraid. Not at all. Instead, it's what we could call a structural reassignment of power. The text essentially argues that the internal presence of the divine is inherently greater and infinitely more powerful than any external worldly threat that could possibly cause that impending dread we defined earlier.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how pervasive this counter-narrative actually is. The author drops in a fascinating piece of trivia here. Apparently, someone once counted that the Bible holds enough fear nots, or variations of that phrase, to cover every single day of the year, 365 times. That repetition is presented by the author as absolute proof of the text's primary antidote. It's framing it as a daily requirement. Every single day, you have to remind yourself of this structural reassignment of power. So if you distill all of those 365 reminders down into one core message, the author states that the Holy Spirit provides one ultimate, singular reason for believers not to fear. God is on our side. That's it. That is the ultimate comfort presented in this text. The idea is that divine presence and support acts as the ultimate shield against the emotional, physical, and spiritual confusion that fear drags in with it. Let's look at how this plays out in a story. Section 3, Elisha and the Unseen Army. This is a brilliant case study in trust. The text sets up a scene with incredibly high tension. We have the prophet Elisha and his servant, and they wake up one morning to find themselves completely surrounded by the tremendous, overwhelming force of the Syrian army. The servant looks out, sees this massive, entirely visible threat, and naturally, he absolutely panics. He is utterly terrified. He is experiencing that exact emotional foreboding and dread of impending misfortune that we talked about at the very beginning. His focus is entirely 100% on the visible, insurmountable odds stacked against them.
But Elisha doesn't panic. Actually, he does the exact opposite. Elisha just calmly asks God to open the eyes of his terrified servant. And when the servant's eyes are open to the broader spiritual reality, he notices something incredible. Surrounding that massive Syrian army is an even greater army, an unseen army full of chariots of fire. The text uses this really vivid imagery to contrast the visible, worldly threat with the invisible, far superior divine protection. The reality was, there were actually far more forces fighting for Elisha than there were against him.
So, the crucial point is captured beautifully by the author using an old classic saying, 1 plus God is always in the majority. The author takes this historical narrative and applies it directly to the reader today, stating, "Child of God, there are more for you than against you." The text argues that as human beings, we have a massive tendency to focus entirely on the obstacles and the threats that are visibly stacked against us, when, according to this biblical framework, we should be focusing entirely on who is actually standing by our side.
Which brings us to our fourth and final section, God versus man, and where to place your trust. The author makes a really keen observation here. We all have a strong propensity to depend on other humans to meet our needs. And hey, support from others is great, we all need it, but human support is inherently flawed. Let's be honest, humans can be fickle. People can let you down, or they can be nowhere to be found when the going really gets tough. The author contrasts that directly with the text's description of the divine, which is described as completely reliable, never leaving, and always right beside you. The logical conclusion the author draws here is that placing your trust in the divine is the only surefire way to ensure you are never ultimately let down.
And this brings our deep dive perfectly full circle, right back to the anchor text for this particular day of the 31 Days of Worship devotional. It's Psalm 118, verses 6 and 8. It reads, "The Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do unto me? It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man." When you read that now, you can really see how every single point the author made, the definition of fear, the 365 daily reminders, the epic story of Elisha, and the unreliability of human assistance, it all perfectly deconstructs and explains the profound theology packed into this one specific verse.
To wrap up our explainer today, the source text actually leaves us with a direct challenge based on this whole theological framework. It asks the reader to seriously evaluate their own dependencies. So, based on everything we've unpacked today about the anatomy of fear and this powerful proposed biblical antidote, I'm going to leave you with a final thought to reflect on for yourself. When the going gets tough and you are staring down the dread of the unknown, where do you genuinely place your trust and confidence? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep learning.